First, I wonder how many of you have seen The Matrix or the Matrix movies? Yes, absolutely. I have to say I love the Matrix movies, especially the first Matrix. That's actually the real one, right? Besides the visual effects and great action sequences, for me, it's the storyline that's really intriguing. The entire Matrix movie is a metaphor for waking up to reality, coming to see our world for what it really is, choosing to understand our context rather than passively going about our day-to-day. Now, the lesson of the movie is that while learning the truth of our context can be difficult, it is the only path to freedom and real change. There's another reason I like The Matrix, and it is because it is about how society organizes our lives in ways we usually don't think about. C. Wright Mills, a well-known sociologist and theorist, came up with a concept he called the sociological imagination that gets at this. What Mills argues is that everyone needs to have a sociological imagination. That is, an awareness of the connection between personal experiences and social conditions. Now, often people look to themselves and what's going on in their own lives to understand their circumstances. They believe that the main reason their life is the way it is, their families, their work, their relationships, their friendships, and both the joys and the challenges that go with those have to do with simply their unique and particular personal experiences. But Mills highlights that our personal experiences are often not very personal at all. They are in many ways the result of broader social conditions that are out of our control. We begin to grasp this when we see that other people like us, who may seem to have quite different immediate circumstances from us, in fact have quite similar life experiences, trajectories, and outcomes. Now, in another life, I used to be an engineer. I began to gain a bit of a sociological imagination for the first time when I was still an engineering student. I was sitting in the front of the class, as I usually do, and class had not yet began, but for some reason that day, I looked behind me. And in a class of about 50, 60 people or so, I saw the demographic pattern. There were few women in the class, and there were few African Americans. And this is a university that was in a city that had a large minority of African Americans. And it struck me. And I asked myself, why are there so few women? Why are there so few African Americans? I didn't have the answer. When the professor came, I went to taking my notes and paying attention. But truthfully, that question and the other epiphanies like that over the years ultimately is what took me down a road towards sociology. Interestingly, that first epiphany happened during my third year in college. The point being, I had been an engineering student for 3 years and hadn't seen what was right there in front of me. What I hope you grasp here is that you can only really come to understand multiracial churches and how they work by taking a wider lens and recognizing that there are some contexts that all multiracial churches and those who lead them must navigate. And these broader social conditions have a profound impact on the structures and cultures within these communities. But once you grasp this, once your sociological imagination is piqued, you can begin to be the kind of leader who is better situated to cultivate racially diverse congregations that truly and authentically do justice. Over the past decade, my research has focused on pastors, race, and social change. I began to turn my attention to religious leaders because the research persistently showed how important they are, right? You are important for fostering racial diversity in your congregations. This work looks at how clergy engages issues of racial justice in a diverse context, whether that be in congregations or the broader community. Now, a guiding frame for both of these books that you see up there is, what is the role of the pastor? What is the role of the pastor? Now, before I talk about the pastoral role, let's first take a step back and discuss what is a role generally. Well, a role, simply put, is a set of expectations, and these expectations come from a variety of sources. They can come from the person who's actually filling the role. They can come from people who are connected to the person filling the role. They can actually come from people who aren't directly connected, but who care about how that role is performed. The reason roles are so important is they are the basis of our everyday interactions with people. We live out our lives based on assumptions that people are going to do what they're supposed to do when they're supposed to do it. And when they don't, it can throw those relationships out of whack. A few examples. If you're a parent and you treat your child like they're the parent and you're the child, it can throw that relationship out of whack. If you try to boss around your boss, that can throw that relationship out of whack. If you're looking for your dentist to clean your teeth and instead they whip out a humidifier and begin to give you a facial, I don't know, actually, that might improve my relationship with my dentist. No, you're not getting what you came there to do, to get your teeth taken care of, right? So we go about our days all day, every day, depending on people doing what they're supposed to do when they're supposed to do it. And we take it for granted. In other words, we expect people to fulfill the expectations of their roles given the context they are in. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the pastoral role. Now, what I have here is first you have the head clergy who has an impact and has an idea of what those expectations will be for the pastoral role. Then we also have the congregation who has ideas about what that pastor is supposed to do. And I tell you from my research, pastors hear what congregants think they're supposed to do. After that, we have our religious community. That matters too. Now, I think about that as our denominations, our religious associations. Maybe it's the leader network of the pastor, because pastors are really well networked. And then after that, I want to talk about a couple macro level factors that matter. That's religion in America and race. Now, these contexts are intentionally represented as concentric circles because the outer ones impact the inner ones. And also, just like the matrix, one can go deeper and deeper, or in this case, farther and farther out from the center to gain a deeper and more full understanding of the context of the pastor and the context of the congregation. What many of you have already learned is heading multiracial churches or being in multiracial churches is not for the faint of heart. Next slide. My research for the first part of my career was on congregations, and in my books, The Elusive Dream and Against All Odds, I looked particularly at multiracial churches. The overarching argument is multiracial churches work to the extent that white people are comfortable. What I find is that whiteness is normalized in these spaces, even in spaces where people of color are the numerical majority, and when the head pastor is a person of color. These churches work in this way because they're governed by what I call white hegemony, which is a concept that integrates theoretically the work of Omi and Wynant in a book called Racial Formation and the work of Antonio Gramsci. Other subsequent work has supported these findings. The question then is, why is cultivating racially diverse religious communities so elusive? And the answer has to do with that broader context. Multiracial churches and the people who lead them are impacted by those two broader structures, race and religion in the US context. And for some, it may feel far away, but it is ever present. So, let's talk about race. When we say race, we're talking about giving meaning to what people look like, to their physical characteristics, or at least particular physical characteristics that are deemed to be important. And the ones that are deemed to be important are your phenotype, our hair texture, our skin color. Now, in the US, at least at the moment, we have 5 racialized categories: Asian, Black, Latina, Hispanic, white, Native American, American Indian, indigenous tribes. And the meanings that are given to these racial categories delineate who is worthy of what power and what resources. Race is a hierarchical structure that is about establishing people's worth and capacities and relationships. Now, race is a society-wide system. Racial categories come with roles, those roles I was talking about, those sets of expectations about how we are to relate to one another. That comes up in who do we marry? Who are we supposed to befriend? It comes up in with who does and gets what in society. It affects where are we supposed to live, what jobs we're supposed to pursue, what positions we're supposed to occupy, which ones have more or less power and authority. See, our society is racialized, and we don't even think about how we go about doing that, and it's tied to race. Now, quite frankly, sometimes when we talk about race, we can skirt around what we're really talking about. So I'm going to focus our attention here a little bit. We're not talking about a generic system of race. What we're talking about here is a very specific racial system, one that's been cultivated and spread throughout not only our country, but that has been cultivated and spread throughout the globe since the expansion of European colonization that began in about the 15th century. And that racial system is white supremacy. It persists today. We take it for granted. I mean, are we aghast that the 50 richest people in the world are white, save perhaps a couple? And also, most of them are nearly all men too, but that's another issue. And that a large majority of those are American? Are we outraged by the whiteness of people who control the world's wealth and who disproportionately occupy the most powerful institutional positions in the US and the world, despite white people only making up about 12% of the world's population? No, we're not. We take it for granted. And that's white supremacy, and that's a system. So what is white supremacy? Well, white supremacy is a racial system that rests on the belief that white people are superior to all other people. Superior in what, you ask? Well, superior in all the ways that really matter. Well, what ways really matter? Well, those that white people in power decide really matter. And you say, Korie, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, you're right, it doesn't. But neither does white supremacy. White supremacist societies have emerged and are sustained in one of two ways. The first way is through force. People in power who become white by their own design decide that people who in their minds look different from them are inferior, or inferior race. They're not white. And due to that inferiority as a race, or supposed inferiority, they are not worthy of having power. Now, often this meant power over land they were living on, power to make decisions about their own lives, power over their own bodies, power to just exist. The problem with white supremacy by force is it requires a whole lot of energy and resources in human life, in money, in energy, in time, and that includes that of whites. And so really, it's not that sustainable. The other way white supremacy reigns is through white hegemony. Hegemony is the preferred way of sustaining white supremacy. So what is white hegemony? White hegemony is a white supremacist system where white dominance and the ideologies, norms, and values that sustain it are taken for granted by whites, and here we go, and people of color. I'll repeat that. White hegemony is a white supremacist system where white dominance, that is their near complete control, and the ideologies, that is their views about how the world should work, norms about how people ought to behave, and values that sustain it, that is what they consider important, are taken for granted by white people and people of color. So what does this mean? Since white supremacy is a system, anyone, regardless of their race, can act in ways that reproduce it or resist it, or because we're human and we're complicated, or both. A white supremacist system that is hegemonic is on autopilot. Nearly everyone to some degree accepts or is resigned to the reality that people of color are, for instance, disproportionately unemployed, make less money, have considerably less wealth, have less freedom, are killed without justice, are put in prison more likely. They're more likely to live in less desirable neighborhoods, occupy relatively few positions of real power, and are relegated to the less desirable jobs. Often when we talk of race, the focus is on people of color. In the classic book Souls of Black Folk, W.E. Du Bois, which was published in 1903, he considered how people of color, Black people in particular, are often situated as a problem. He notes that even white people who were sympathetic thought of Black people and people of color as being a problem. But what Du Bois came to understand in his development as a scholar is that at the center of white supremacy isn't understanding the souls of Black folk or people of color, but rather understanding what does it mean to be white, which he wrote about in his piece, The Souls of White Folk. Du Bois and scholars after him have accounted for whiteness through observation and empirical research. Summing this work, we see that whiteness is an identity that has meaning and content too. To be white is to be able to live in a society where whites' dominance and control are presumed to be normative, just the way things are. To be white is to go about life with the belief that you're right or you know better, or at least you know more or better than Black and brown and Asian people. To be white often means you can be oblivious about your race. You don't have to think about it. That is, if you're white, other groups have a race, but you and other whites are actually, for all intents and purposes, raceless. And this is the slippery part. If whiteness is to see oneself as raceless, then to be white doesn't really mean anything. If to be white doesn't really mean anything, then there is no white hegemony. And if there is no white hegemony, then there is no white supremacy. The second broader context is religion in America. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the idea of the separation of church and state, and that's a colloquial summation of a part of the First Amendment which states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. As a consequence, religion in the United States is wholly voluntary. Religion has operated in many respects as a marketplace. All organizations, including religious ones, though, need people and money to do the work. Religious organizations, though, being largely dependent on people voluntarily donating their energy, time, and money, must attract and appeal to people's sentiments if they want them to stay and give. That's just keeping it real. And frankly, this matters for multiracial churches. Research shows that white families in the US have about 8 times the wealth of Black families, 5 times the wealth of Latino families, and twice the wealth of Asian families. So these two broader macro-level systems, the US racial system and the separation of church and state, can actually lead and produce religious racial homogeneity, that is segregation. It encourages us to do that. But I do want to note something, that space for religious racial homogeneity in our society is a good thing for people of color. Yeah, I'm going to say that again. The space that our society affords for people of color to worship in their own space and way is a good thing. It has protected people of color and affirmed our identity and sense of worthiness and worth in a society that has not consistently. It has been the only place where our dignity as people is preserved. And in many ways, pastors of color of multiracial churches, from my research and others, would not be able to continue to do what they do without their presence. Now, over the past couple decades, though, multiracial churches have been on the rise, from 6 to 18% overall, next slide, and 17 to 23% for evangelical congregations. But still, we see considerable divisions by race on consequential racial issues and attitudes. So looking at this table developed by my colleagues, Glenn Bracey and Michael Emerson, we see that whites and Blacks continue to have different ideas about why racial inequality exists. It is wider among Christians. If we look at individual explanations for racial inequality, white Christians are still more likely to place the blame on the individual, and Black Christians are the least likely. We see here the intersection of race and religion and the impact at the micro level. Now, I will turn to some of my own data from my study, the Religious Leadership and Diversity Project, upon which my book with Rebecca Kim, A Strange Pioneers, is based. The RLDP, which was conducted in 2014 through 2016, includes a diverse sample of multiracial church-head clergy across religious traditions and race. These pastor stories provide insight into how the macro level impacts their leadership experiences at the micro level. Now, we address many different ways this occurs in our book, but I'm going to briefly focus on just three: the impact of racialized politics, the racial tax, and authority. So let me introduce you to this one pastor. He's a Black evangelical pastor, and he succinctly puts it this way. He says, "We have people who think that Obama is probably the next best thing, and then you have people who probably think he's close to the Antichrist." How do you deal with racial justice in such a context without paying a heavy toll in an America that's highly racialized and where religion is voluntary? You don't. When you do, people leave, and churches need people. Often pastors, especially ones who are evangelical, our research finds, avoid addressing these sorts of issues in favor of keeping the peace. Another evangelical, this one a Korean American, highlights the challenges of fostering diversity and trying to deal with racial justice at the same time. And he says this: "It's not easy. You realize how different people are. You realize how challenging it is. Things that homogenous culture would never have, like communications or disagreements about. Like, in a multicultural sense, you're having to tread carefully at times. I mean, we use Ferguson, for instance. And in a homogenous culture, whether Black or white, this can be a real rallying, unifying thing, for whichever perspective. But in a diverse church, you're thinking, man, how is this person going to take it? How are they going to take it? And you know what? You say you're going to offend someone most likely. So it's really hard." Expectations of congregants and what race is and how it should manifest as a structure and identity affect this pastor in how he thinks about and engages his role. I want to highlight that this pastor was a church planter. He started his own church. He was heading it. But what is also evident is what he wants is not necessarily important here. He claimed to have a very socially progressive ideas about race, but he was still bound by the structures, that of his congregation and the broader level macro ones in which he was embedded. When we consider white multiracial church pastors in our study, Catholic priests of multiracial churches are actually most aware of systemic racism and demonstrate the most investment in dealing with issues of racial injustice. They were also the most willing to disrupt the comfort of their white congregants if need be. Now, I want to make a point to say that I'm not saying all Catholic priests have this awareness or approach, but among white pastors who head multiracial churches, Catholic priests were most socially aware and engaged. In fact, when we saw racial justice-oriented pastors, it was more often among Catholic priests in our study, regardless of race. Still, Catholic priests face similar challenges as evangelicals who are more justice-oriented. Just because they are aware and engaged doesn't mean their congregants are. For example, one priest of a racially diverse parish shared a story with me that exemplifies the kinds of challenges priests have to navigate when they have to or they want to do racial justice work. He recalls a conversation he had with one parishioner about the immigration center that was affiliated with the parish. This person was inquiring about people who takes advantage of the center, and this is what he told me. They asked me, "Are all those people illegal?" Yeah, well, all these people are documented. I said, "Well, not all of them." "Oh, you mean some of them are?" "Yeah, some of them are. That's why they're here, to get their things straightened out. They come for the immigration center." People said to me, one lady said to me, "So somebody comes to your office and they're undocumented?" "Yeah." "So why don't you call the police?" I said, "Well, because we're a church. We're trying to get people back on track and get their status adjusted and stuff. But they're illegal." I said, "Well, yeah, but I mean, they came here and they want to start a life, and we can help them do that. We're a church, by the way. We're not the police." But some people just don't understand that. Doing justice and diversity is difficult for all pastors, but it is particularly so for pastors of color. They are what my colleague Rebecca Kim and I call estranged pioneers. They leave their familiar ethno-racial home churches to explore a new way of doing church, that is, in leading multiracial congregations. However, being a multiracial church pastor is not valued by their home religious communities, and they are left to navigate a racialized space, including in the multiracial religious communities they lead, where they are consistently perceived and treated as inferior to their white peers. They are first dismissed, and then they are dissed. They are dismissed because being a multiracial church pastor is not compatible with the aims of their ethno-racial home religious communities. And they are dissed because they do not experience the same power and privileges as their white counterparts in multiracial congregations. Subsequently, leading in diverse spaces for people of color is a particularly burdensome thing, emotionally, socially, and perhaps I would say even spiritually. For instance, pastors of color experience a racial tax. That is, the burden to overachieve because of a simple reality. People of color are perceived as less desirable or less capable leaders than whites. And I should say our research shows that it's both whites and people of color who hold this. To compensate for this, pastors of color of multiracial churches pursue more credentials in the form of special training, greater experience, and education. They strive to work harder than their white counterparts to prove to themselves and others that they can lead as well. Consider the thoughts of this Asian American priest who has decades of experience working in a mainline Protestant denomination on being a priest of color. Given the disadvantages that priests of color have, he advises young priests of color to simply work harder, pursue greater credentials, and perform better than their white counterparts. And he explains, I was telling our fellows, if you're the same or equal in stature and ability and education like the white fox, you're not going to make it. You have got to go beyond. If he, the white fox, is a star, you have to be a superstar. Whatever this priest meant by calling a white person the white fox, what is clear is he believes one way pastors of color can deal, and this is after decades of experience, with the racial prejudice and discrimination they encounter is by outperforming their white counterparts in their denomination or tradition. So why do they do more? They do more because they don't feel that they are respected as authority figures. An African-American mainline Protestant pastor concurs with this priest. Like many other pastors of color in our study, he is highly educated with multiple degrees. And he confessed that he tries to do everything with excellence. While this seems to be working to attract Latinx and Asian people to his church, he has a hard time attracting white people because in his view, they are simply unused to submitting to leaders in general, and especially leaders of color. He explains, I believe that it's difficult for white people to have black leaders. I'm as educated as any pastor that you would find. We try to do everything with excellence here. A trained opera singer who has a master's in church music. This guy is highly skilled, yet we find it difficult to attract and keep whites. We do not have that problem with Latinos, and to a certain extent, we don't have that problem with Asians. What is my thesis for that? I think white people don't want to submit to leadership. This pastor tries his best to compensate for his race and does everything with high excellence in an effort to encourage white congregants to support his leadership. But even still, he has to accept that it may not be enough. The racial tax, challenges to authority, the racialized political context can lead to personal, emotional, and spiritual burdens for pastors of color who head multiracial churches. These factors and what they represent are why multiracial churches that truly live into and do justice are elusive. Still, we argue pastors of color are in many ways the most qualified to lead multiracial spaces that aim to be just because they have what we call racialized multicultural competency. They are at a minimum bicultural and able to traverse at least two cultures, their own ethno-racial culture as well as the majority white culture. As a result of their experiences with individual or collective racism, they are often better able to see and understand how the U.S. racialized system works when compared to their white counterparts. And actually, a very large majority of the white-head clergy in our study do not have these capabilities, and they readily admit it. Neo, Morpheus, or Trinity couldn't become who they really were and make a real difference until they chose to swallow the right colored pill, learning the truth of the world they were living in and accept the responsibility of freedom. I suppose what I'm saying here is neither can multiracial church pastors, or any of us for that matter. To do the work that brings freedom, that proclaims liberty, that sets captives free, we must first choose to understand how this world really works, embrace the truth and reality of it and our complicity in it. And then and only then can we be who we are called and profess to be in a way that represents the business of our God. I have of late been sitting with the work of Howard Thurman. Anybody familiar with Howard Thurman? Yeah. Dr. Thurman was a co-pastor and co-founder of the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples, which is probably the first intentional multiracial church. That was founded in 1944. He was a theologian and a dean of 2 divinity schools, Howard Divinity School at Boston University. And he's a prolific author. And the book he's probably most well known for is Jesus and the Disinherited. Another fact about Dr. Thurman is he was a mentor of Dr. Martin Luther King. And in fact, it's understood that Dr. Martin Luther King used to carry Jesus and the Disinherited in his briefcase as he was on the civil rights movement. I want to encourage us to think about how can we bridge justice and diversity and really engage that work authentically. I will close with a few thoughts. My work on head clergy and congregations has led me to ponder and reflect on the gospel and the words of Jesus and the prophets and the life of Jesus. Influenced by Thurman, I wonder about the broader social context in which Jesus was born and lived, and why he died. Not the theological explanation of why he died, but the historical, factual one. He willingly allowed the state to execute him for challenging an empire that oppressed people, for their ethnicity, gender, class, for respecting them, for loving them, for empowering them. What does that tell us about our God and who we are and are to be? Jesus told a wealthy man who wanted to follow him to go away until he laid down his wealth. He didn't want his money, and he didn't want his status. What does that tell us about our God and who we are and who we are to be? Jesus tells us this Christian journey will be hard. We will be resisted. We will experience persecution. A good deal of Christian theology that I've heard, and perhaps you too, has taught that the persecution is for being a Christian, which is often boiled down to claiming an identity and not engaging in certain worldly behaviors. But I wonder if the persecution Jesus was referring to was for the same reason he was executed. He was freeing oppressed people. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Are we not called to do the same? Free people to love one another well and honestly. And so, considering the work that is before you, before us, the work of building diverse communities, whether or not they're in a congregation, that are truly just and truly freeing people, that break down not simply walls, but hierarchies of power, just as Jesus did, as is exemplified by his life and death, may we be encouraged. Because it's for this, I believe, is the work of God. Thank you.